Welcome, everybody. I'm pleased to have with me today Corneliu Bjola, who is an associate professor of international relations at Oxford University and also a frequent contributor to CPD's blog, and Hyeon, who is the brand new director of the Korea Foundation here in Los Angeles. More importantly, a former student of mine. 지금 누구 학생입니까? 누구 선생입니까? We're going to be talking today about digital diplomacy, a very important and current and timely topic for all public diplomats. And I think I will ask Corneliu to lead us off with a discussion about what we call DD. And I'll turn it over to you for your comments.
All right. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk about a topic which I think we probably all agree has become one of the hot issues, in the past decade or so. Talk about digital diplomacy as a new concept. If you think about it, in a sense, most of our life nowadays is governed by the way in which we collect, read, and interpret data. This is what is called the digital age. We started with this, this kind of tool that barely existed 10 years ago, and things, I think, are moving in a direction pretty fast. So what I mean by this with the digital transformation is that it's a new medium. So in the broader context of our discussion today of soft power and hard power, I think it's also good to pause for a moment and take in what this digital transformation means. When the concept of soft power was proposed by Joseph Nye in the 1990s, there was a particular historical context, the end of the Cold War, the hope for global governance, this kind of liberal, multilateral international order, and that created the impetus, the propensity for acceptance of that norm. It was in the total pre-digital age. What does it mean now when you have this kind of new technology emerging that actually shapes the way in which political relations and economic relationships are drawn? I was, in the previous panel, there was a mention about, President Trump being brilliant in terms of being able to ask or make the media jump up and down based on this kind of tweets. I would actually qualify that comment in the sense it's not necessarily the president that does, it's the medium. If you take away that particular tool from President Trump, I'm not sure whether he will be able to create this kind of political waves as it does. And that speaks volume about the type of challenge that we see nowadays. So my purpose today is to try to explain a little bit what are the challenges and also the opportunities that the digital age opens for diplomacy, how it changes diplomacy, and also think about, what does it all mean for South Korea? So to do this, I'm trying to unpack a little bit the key features of the digital medium, because it's a total different language. We are barely scratching the surface. We discover new features as we go along. And for instance, the moment when I published that particular volume in 2015, many things have changed. So I'm going to focus on 5 dimensions. So what exactly is essential about the digital transformation nowadays? What's the bloodstream of the digital transformation? If you focus on that, you may understand that the key element that makes all move is data sharing. That people share voluntarily a huge amount of information about themselves. It didn't happen before. That's a dominant and essential feature. And then you have to think about what kind of data sharing are we talking about. So the point here, if you want to be part of the game, you have to share information about your institutions, about your policies, about your values. But be careful, because this is a very competitive environment. Others are doing the same. So you have to understand how to target a particular audience and how to talk to that particular audience. So one part of the data sharing is a what question. What are you going to share? What kind of content are you going to share? The second part of the data sharing element is who. Who are you talking to? And that's, in a sense, a big question for public diplomacy in general. The idea that can talk with the general public, this kind of amorphous mass that exists out there, I think that's one opportunity for the digital public diplomacy, the ability to fragment that audience. In a paper that I've been working, I introduced the concept of network of networks. Who do diplomats usually talk to? They talk to journalists, they talk to academics, they talk to other journalists, to other diplomats. But these networks that I'm talking, the online public, it's a volatile, it's an unstable, it reconfigures fast. It's also, in a sense, very fluid. So that's a different type of way in which you can want to engage. If you want to make an impression, if you want to be consistent and be able to reach, that requires you to be more accurate in terms of how you developed your strategy in terms of data sharing. There is another element which brings me to the second point about the role of emotions. Another feature that we discovered, we stumbled over in the digital. In public diplomacy, and there was a discussion today about making rational arguments. This is how we think. We have certain objectives, certain plans. We present them. The audience understands it. It doesn't understand. We clarify. We follow up with data, with facts. In the digital, we discover that emotions actually frame a lot the way in which information is absorbed, is presented, and also leads to action. So the role of emotions here, I think it's important to note. There have been studies proving this. In the digital, for instance, and that raises positive provocations, but also opportunities. There have been studies, for instance, showing how different emotions travel online. Happiness, joy, travels faster than sadness. But guess what? Nothing travels faster than anger. It goes viral. Now you may ask, what about these emotions? Where do they come from? Why are the people so hooked online on emotions? Part is because of the sheer volume of data that exists now is being shared. It goes back to the first point on data sharing. It's information overload. We are bombarded nowadays, lots of data because of this, because of this, because of the engagement that we have. So this is how we cognitively process information. We select what is relevant and what is not, for better or for worse. Emotions are becoming important also because, and we've seen this kind of situation, emotion contagion. And this is not speculation. Even Facebook conducted a study in 2012. It was published with a collaboration of some university, one from California. It was published in 2014. It attracted a lot of criticism on ethical grounds. And it proved actually that it was done on about 6,000, 700,000 users, that by exposing users to more positive or negative news, what is called emotional valence, the degree of positivity or negativity of a message, that influences how people feel. That's powerful stuff that people in the propaganda area love it. And we know we love it because we have seen some example. In Germany, there is already a famous one, the Lisa case that happened in January 2015. I'm not going to go over much about it. But the point is that emotions make people to get off this chair from the front of the screen and move to the streets. That's, in a sense, the connection that sometimes went to action, the motivator. So on one hand, we have data sharing. The second aspect I mentioned is about the role of emotions. It doesn't stop here. A third element which we can recognize in the digital is the role of the visual, the visual narratives nowadays. There's been a change from the text to the visual. Again, the numbers are there, the statistics are there. I mean, it's the way in which we process information. We remember 10% of what we hear, 20% of what we read, and about 80% of what we see. Has been applied to Twitter. 30% increase of Twitter reach if you use an image in addition to the text. Photo on Facebook increases your reach by 53%. Images are powerful. And that places, and has implication for public diplomacy as well, places the onus on visual narratives. There is a lot of analysis of image. Who is the protagonist? What's the message? What's the context of them? And what's the moral angle? You may remember, for instance, the height of the refugee crisis in Europe in 2015. There was a particular image of Alan Kurdi, the boy, on the Turkish beach, that changed completely overnight the position of many European governments relative for a short period. Images could be very powerful. Again, it's an opportunity, but also a challenge in terms of manipulation. So images, again, emerge as a major characteristic in this kind of new medium. A fourth element is the role of algorithms. Most of our communication is done, and I think that's, in a sense, a promise that sort of was made by the digital. That now we can reach millions of people. This is why public diplomacy people like it. You can reach millions of people in real time without filters, without the media, without the TV. You can talk directly with them. Well, the problem is that if you want to do this, you have to overcome the algorithms. The algorithms that exist on Twitter, that exist on Facebook. What do they mean? I mean, it's nothing malefic here. Facebook doesn't do algorithms to manipulate necessarily. It's because they want you to stay on the platform. And because of the preferences, it absorbs your preference, the likes, and it gives you the information that you like. This is the role of the algorithm. But at the same time, it comes with certain costs. It comes with the echo chambers, right? The fact that you listen to the same people by selectively putting your audience. There was something else which is relevant for public diplomacy. At the beginning, for instance, on Facebook, you can reach lots of people. Now, what they call organic reach, the people you can use without paying for ads, has been reduced significantly. So if you have like 1,000 friends on Facebook, your message gets now to about 6%, so 65 people. For those who mailing accounts, it gets down to 2. Why is that? Because this is how Facebook makes money. If you want to reach more, you have to pay. But that's part of one aspect of the algorithm that actually structure the mediation. There is a filter, in other way. There is a filter between you and your audience. You don't talk directly with Nick Cullen. Nick Cullen will probably talk with me, or I'll be able to reach him depending on the way in which this algorithm structure my preferences. Why is that relevant? Because this is how I can reach my audience or not. And the fifth point is about the role of artificial intelligence nowadays, which starts from the lower end of the complexity scale, the chatbots who have been used, for instance, in visa application, legal aid for refugee, consular registrations, but there is more to it. I attended a workshop organized by the German MFA 2 weeks ago, and I was surprised to learn about the developments they make in artificial intelligence. I say, well, what are you working on? Well, we are building a mass information analytical tool. It says, sounds very ominous. And so what is that? So basically, it's a machine that feeds all the available information, public information, in order to identify patterns, in order to identify networks that are relevant for a bilateral relationship or multilateral relationship, and in a transparent fashion. So the whole role of the big data analytics is now taken seriously by Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they're harnessing the powers of artificial intelligence and machine learning to make sense of this sheer volume of data. So these are some elements that we discovered in terms of the way in which the digital medium now works. Data sharing, role of emotion, visuality, algorithms, and artificial intelligence. And they both present, all these elements present opportunities for public diplomacy, being better able to reach specific audiences, to talk with them, to engage them. That's the idea of the new public diplomacy, to engage, not only to broadcast message, but to engage. But at the same time, it comes with provocations, because the same technology could be used in a more nefarious manner. And that's not surprising if we think about it. A knife, you can use it to cut bread or to harm someone. Nuclear technology used for building nuclear weapons or for nuclear power. Technology always has a good, bright, and the dark side. But you have to be aware of both in case you want to be successful in harnessing these kind of new tools in foreign policy. And let me probably pass this to you. And that's, what will that all mean for South Korea? I think there are certain assets that South Korea already brings to the table. It's a recognized technological power, and everybody's seen that. And that speaks volume about the fact that society is already prepared or embraced the digital to a certain extent. So I think for them, for the government and the others, to make this kind of transition and to harness is not going to be a big difficulty. The challenge, on the other hand, is what I call the rabbit problem. The technology is moving very fast, and you're trying to catch it or to put a lasso on it, as you mentioned before, with a very slow bureaucratic machine. That's not only a problem of South Korean Ministry of every Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because they work at a different pace. So that raises some interesting questions about, how the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which in general, when you think about diplomacy, and especially in the West, it's a 400, even more, institution. They change incrementally, and this is good. They change incrementally. You don't want to adopt anything, only because it's fashionable. But at the same time, if you don't adapt flexibly enough, then you may miss certain things that. So that I think it's an institutional problem as well, and maybe that can be serve as a point for discussion later. So I think I'm going to stop here if I haven't exceeded my time.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. With that, I will turn the floor over to Hyeon, who can talk perhaps about what Korea is doing in the digital field and how some of what Dr. Bjola talked about might be applicable there.
Actually, we have not communicated in the previous times for this seminar, but I just found that my remarks will sound like a prelude to his updates of the current development. I think first and foremost, I would like this Annenberg School for this wonderful opportunity to learn more about the current developments and the ideas on digital diplomacy. As a practitioner, today's mission for me here, as I perceived, is succinctly paraphrasing the overall issues in public diplomacy. I would try to translate multiple layers and dimensions of digital diplomacy into practice to the possible extent I can. In the process of raising questions related to the digital diplomacy, I came up with the first question about what is diplomacy. According to outstanding scholar in this field, Professor Bjola, public diplomacy is about relationship management and maintaining international order. And I heard someone say that if you acknowledge the crude simplicity, diplomacy is relations between nations, that does not include military conflict. Here, once again, if I try to paraphrase this, diplomacy is every endeavor to prevent military conflict. So as a public diplomacy practitioners, we are trying to prevent whatever kind of conflicts in the international relations. As we are well aware, Public diplomacy is just a part of diplomacy that involves nations communicating with foreign publics. I found two dimensions in the nature of the issues in the public diplomacy realm. One is the global issues requiring concerted efforts at the global level. And the other one dimension is issues of potential international conflict. In approaching these issues with potential international conflict, general consensus that have been made thus far is traditional way of face-to-face diplomacy is far better because catching the intention of the counterparts is very important. But those kind of things cannot be done through the cyberspace. So digital diplomacy as a tool of the public diplomacy cannot replace the conventional way or wisdom of the diplomacy. The way nations communicating with foreign publics can be divided into three styles according to the communication studies. Those are one-way communication, two-way bilateral communication, and the networked way, the multi-interactional communications, which we are now discussing. Digital diplomacy concerns, I think, all these three styles of communication. One-way communication is the most prevalent and the historic communication approach as seen in the broadcast, such as Voice of America and BBC and the KBS World. Two-way communication is bilateral communication between message senders and recipients. There is a certain extent of interaction existed. Here, the interaction means the feedback of the opinions between these two message communicators. Communication in a networked way refers to multiple actors communicating via network media, such as social media, in relation to definitely international relations. In this process, a lot of data accumulated in proportion to the engagement level. The engagement level is one of the crucial elements in the digital diplomacy. I think thanks to the advances in the information and communication technology and globalization, current modes of communication has remarkably transferred to the network one. The overall trend has influenced us to seriously consider the emerging means of public diplomacy, which is digital diplomacy. And lastly, the digital diplomacy, again, according to the scholars, digital diplomacy broadly refers to the use of internet and the information and communication technologies, from video conferencing to social media platforms, to help state and non-state actors to manage international trends. Put differently, diplomacy is operating in a new media environment, one that is very different from the privacy of the conference room, the conventional diplomacy, and the mass broadcast media of the 21st century. That's why we need to explore the essential characters of these changes and what are the consequences for us. According to the scholars in this field, digital diplomacy has three main components. Number one is the public diplomacy component. Number two is information accessibility component. Number three is data analysis component. Scholars and researchers say that if we get from the big data relative retention rate, unmet audience expectations, and geo-targeting informations, we can get the engagement report, and this engagement report can help us, the practitioners of the public diplomacy, to craft more successful content and promotional strategies. As said earlier, one-way, two-way modes of communication are part of a conventional form of the diplomacy, while networked communication demonstrates new and transforming features of our relationship management. To manage a thriving relationship in a mobile world requires an increasing forward-looking approach. Those who conduct research on digital diplomacy present to us that social media helps advance foreign policy goals via three key aspects of public diplomacy engagement, Actually, this was presented by Professor Bjola. The first function is agenda setting. The second function is presence expansion. And the third function is conversation generating. So practically, at the concrete working level, scholars say that digital diplomacy can help embassies and Ministry of Foreign Affairs to make sense of the nature and the gravity of the international issues and events in real time. And the second, streamline the decision-making process. And thirdly, manage the public's expectation, and firstly, facilitate crisis termination. But at the same time, the digital diplomacy needs to be used with great care, as digital diplomacy does have downsides, such as disinformation and factual inaccuracies and coordination gaps as well. Lastly, and concludingly, as a public diplomacy practitioner, reflecting on those elements of the digital diplomacy, I visited several social media accounts of Korea's government branches, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Culture, and also the public diplomacy organization represented by the Korea Foundation. And I found that the Korea, as Professor Bjola mentioned, they seem to still place most of their resources in one-way communication mode, just publicizing what they are doing to promote and to increase Korea's soft power content. They put all the publicizing content. And I think that's the limit of the digital, one side of the limitation of the digital diplomacy has. And in comparison, I benchmarked the United Kingdom's Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the UK's side, and they seem to start placing more resources in sharing information by network system of communication. They are really moving forward. I want to hear a little bit of the current development from Professor Bjola again here. Diplomats as well as public diplomacy practitioners craft a strategy in accordance with which public diplomacy resources will be allocated. To do this, they need more proven data or evidence that support or justify the expanded utilization of digital diplomacy will bring in intended outcomes. This might be, I surmise that this might be one big reason for Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other public diplomacy organizations and non-governmental organizations do not currently proactively moving forward by placing more of their energy and money into social media engagement. At the current stage, digital diplomacy may serve as a tool for mainly three purposes. I summarize like this. Just to connect you can share the right content with the right people. As Professor Bjola mentioned, the right targeting to realize the set out strategy. And the second, to build an interactive dialogue with the public and foster a sense of community, to give the sense of the affiliation to the country who are sending out the messages that we are pro your countries. And the third thing is to identify key influencers, because to reach out the public, the role of the influencers and multipliers are so important. But we did it in offline. It requires much more resources. But if we do that on the digital platform, it will save a lot of resources. So in terms of that, it can be said as strategic. So my question, so I prepared one most important question for public practitioners is that I am wondering if scholars really view the increased level of social engagement on the digital platform as achieving public diplomacy's major objectives, enhancing awareness of the public, foreign public. At what point of time frame in the development of a current network communication, or on what occasion or momentary event, implementing digital diplomacy in full scale. By this, I mean that putting a lot of resources into this than the conventional form of public diplomacy, or making an enormous resource allocations in digital diplomacy will take place. I don't think that you are a prophet, but you can predict what will be like the digital diplomacy's future. And if there is not any clear causal relationship between the enhanced public engagement and the increased change of the engaged people's perception, attitude, and behavior, which area we are trying to change or steer in view of the public diplomacy strategy, how one can justify a public diplomacy strategy, a strategist to utilize this tool among many, except in the proven, I think this is the proven case. In the case of disaster, natural disaster management, as well as global issues that require concerted collaboration globally. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Director Choi. Good questions. In fact, these presentations, I think, have raised a lot of very, very interesting questions. Let me start with the elephant in the room, which both of you have mentioned, and that is, does the new media serve to enhance or undermine public diplomacy? Is it a net negative or a net positive? On the one hand, it gives us direct two-way communication. It expands our reach. It enables us to listen better. It helps during crisis management. It has facilitated the emergence of citizen diplomacy. And it has produced a number of interesting innovations. On the other hand, we have fake news, bots, trolls, competing and contradictory messaging, 24-hour news cycles, what I call firestarters. These are incidents or people like the minister in Florida who threatened to burn the Koran, or the film about Mohammed, which spread globally. Does new media punish moderation? Does it coarsen diplomatic discourse? Does it undermine or degrade the traditional skill set of diplomacy? So which is it? Does it provide us more benefit or more deficit?
Well, what we've seen at the beginning, especially the Arab Spring, there was the hope part of it. This is going to empower people. They're going to challenge authority. We're going to have democracy everywhere. That was the hope. And a few years later, we saw the dark side coming. And that's, I think, where the pendulum sort of moving back. So the hope, in a sense, now is that there will be some sort of equilibrium after moving back and forth, in this way. And we've seen some elements of that. In Europe, for instance, you say, okay, if we don't do it because it can create this kind of trouble or can instigate, so what's the solution? And they passively waited and see how this kind of fake news, disinformation, aggressive propaganda coming from Russia has started actually to infiltrate the public sphere in Europe. And it had implications. It had implications in elections. I don't want to mention another big elephant in the room here, right? So it has, so the problem is you do it if you want. If you don't do it, you are forced to do it. So what was the solution? The European Action Service that set up a unit to deal with this kind of disinformation. But when it is a public diplomacy sort of unit, in the sense of trying to clarify the claims, to try to create awareness about the type of problem, because, how do you deal with this information in the new medium? Do you create, when you are attacked by a factory of trolls, do you create your own factory of trolls? If you do this, then you lose the moral ground. It affects your reputation, the values that are supposed to defend. So then the solution then was, okay, so we're going to deal with this based on our values, and we'll create this kind of strategy in which we're going to raise awareness, we're going to explain, the public what is going on, and so on and so forth. At the same time, they realized that, the problem of emotions is difficult to contain, especially for the reason I mentioned. Emotions travel very fast, and if you react with anger to anger, you actually create more opportunities for those actually attacking you. There was an event a couple of years ago at NATO dealing with the problem of trolling. And the panel was discussing solutions. We say, okay, so what are we going to deal with the problem of trolls? What are we going to deal with the problem of fake news, of disinformation? Shall we call them out? Shall we be aggressive? Shall we have, a factory of trolls to contract? And someone, a minor voice at the table, said, well, we have to fight emotions with emotions. He said, what do you mean? He says, look, in this case, and that was a NATO event, headquarters, serious business. I said, well, we have to use humor. What do you mean now you use humor? Are we going to hire Jerry Seinfeld, to advise you as a consultant? Believe it or not, 3 months ago, NATO produced a study, a manual, how to use sarcasm and humor to deal with the problem of disinformation, for its staff, and in order to diffuse tension, in order to advance, and to protect the narrative that you're trying to advance in terms of. So there is a problem of emotion that you have to understand. This is why I try to call and highlight this issue. It's a different medium than the usual face-to-face. It also should be clarified here that the digital is not going to replace the personal at this stage, right? It's not. There is a fear, especially the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that the digital now sort of the robot diplomat are going to take over in a decade or so, and there will be no need, for personal connections. That still matters. It's about the relationship, the history of the relationship that has. But the digital can help a lot with many aspects. You mentioned crisis management. Let me add, because it was raised before, the question of negotiations, of international negotiation. You already seen a little bit of that, the way in the context of Korea. And why is that important? It puts on the table back, this argument advanced by Robert Putnam in 1988, the two-level game, right? That, all international negotiations depend on finding configuration of win sets between agreement at the international level and agreement at domestic level. If you have a gap, you either cannot get an agreement at international level, or you cannot get ratification in the Congress, because, the interest groups will oppose that. So the digital, and I think that probably we can discuss whether it's a strategy or it's just, it's on one hand, with this kind of tweets, the president actually is trying to build some domestic support for a particular policy, which, I don't know, maybe others disagree, but at the same time to improve its leverage, because, with the other side. The question is, does it work? Can that, be a strategy effective? I'm conducting a research study on Brexit, the negotiation between the European Union and UK, using the social media accounts of the main negotiators. And I use this kind of algorithm, putting a lot of information in it, and then trying to identify a scale of intensity of the message. These are people who are chief negotiators, but they spend time personally on Twitter accounts to report this and that, right? So they're taking this seriously. So when you look at what they're talking about, and when they look, for instance, there is some interesting discrepancies that you notice. So in a sense, it helps because of this conscious or unconscious way in which they communicate. It can identify certain themes that, and give solidity to certain trends in the negotiation. Most interestingly, what I found is who are they talking to? The network analysis that you mentioned. Who are the people connected in that particular network? And that's a valuable information that you can actually use to predict, interestingly enough, how coherent the negotiation position of that side is, based on what they say and the strength of the ties between the nodes of various networks. But that's, again, big data analytics that can be used. It's a different type of take that I think can be interesting to explore further. Negotiations. Again, it's not that people are not going to meet, but now, you can actually anticipate certain things, from the way in which they communicate, unless they stop sharing data about this, so that will complicate things.
Well, thank you. Hyeon, do you want to add anything to that, or?
Oh, I raised actually the evaluation factor of the public diplomacy to you, so it's your turn to give some insights.
Well, I think we only have a short time left, so rather than my asking all the questions, let's open it up. I'm sure there's lots of...
Well, I'm struck, Corneliu, by the way in which what you're describing conforms to Marshall McLuhan's tetrad of media effects model, where he says something's going to be reversed, something's going to be retrieved, something will be made obsolete, something will be enhanced. And mapping what you're saying onto that, the big reverse seems to be a move away from the big blocks of one-way exposure to written text. The retrieving of emotion and visual, that seems really familiar, going back to the way in which propaganda was working. Actually, it's very familiar from the First World War, even down to work on rumors, use of humor. All these things are incredibly familiar from the foundational playbook of propaganda. What's made obsolete? I think we can see the approaches that are out of date now. But it does rather focus attention on the things that are enhanced. And the stuff where we have no historical precedent really is the use of artificial intelligence. And some of the things that have been coming up around the presence of bots, artificially magnifying particular voices. And so I wonder if you could go back to that and say, where do you see that? Where do you see that going?
At the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
And why is that? I mean, this unit is made possible by the 3G technology. Without the 3G technology, we'll never had the smartphone and the apps and everything. Now, they are preparing in Europe in a couple of years, to move to 5G. That means, the volume of data that is going to be shared, the users are going to increase by a factor of 3, 4, maybe 5 times. But it's not only that. 3G allowed Facebook, allowed Twitter, allowed Instagram. The question we have to ask, is also what 5G is going to the ecosystem. What kind of apps? Augmented reality and virtual reality are next in line. The Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been using 360. It's not pure virtual reality, but it's there. Virtual reality, big possible benefits for public diplomacy. I was surprised the Olympics are going to take place in February, and I thought that virtual reality, everything, it's already in place there, in order to promote, the event. But I think that will be one element because the technology allows for that type of data-intensive and fast way of augmented reality is here. The new iPhone and the new Samsung come with incorporated tools to develop your augmented reality. It's mass consumption now. You can decorate the entire room easily. You don't need to be a data scientist. So from this point of view, what I'm saying with artificial is that the volume of data will increase, and you need to make sense of this type of volume of data. Then don't know exactly what kind of technology per se. Facebook, it took about 3 or 4 times to get it right in order for the company, for that type of idea to take off. Twitter has, was very lucky in a sense, to get it from the beginning. But other apps that actually going to shape in which we process.
But then, sorry, just to come back on this, every landscape suits a particular entity, right? And so water suits fish, right? Tundra suits polar bears. And what does this new what kind of entity is best suited? Because it may be that a complex country like the United States, which contains multiple stories and multiple contradictions, is not well suited to this type of world, but a smaller unit, like a city where you have cohesion, will be much better suited to telling stories in this world. So if you were trying to pick which kind of entity would work especially well in this emerging environment, and who's going to be out of place in this kind of environment, who will be disadvantaged, who will be the dinosaurs that can't manage the oxygen mix and the,
It's a great question, because one of the issues that comes up with this kind of digital transformation is the following: how is it going? What's the big picture? How is it going to affect the global affairs? When we had the steam power, it put Britain on the map, right, as a technology. You have electricity and oil, put America on the map. The digital, who is going to be put on the map? And now there is two schools of thought. One say, well, the beauty of it is that small countries, it's a great power equalizer, right? Because everybody can do it. Do we have evidence for this? Well, the only evidence we have, Estonia, country of 2 million people, big digital country, everything is digitized. And interestingly enough, some big names, are going and learning from them. But on the other hand, may say, well, that's true, and it works better. It works well, with this kind of quick adaptation, flexible leadership. On the other hand, if you say the other thing, you say, well, this is going to increase the already power asymmetries that exist nowadays.
But one thing I can see here, and just to round this off, is that if you are a country that has no vested interest in stability or order, where all you need to do is to mess things up, you have a tremendous advantage. And this is the advantage that Russia has right now. If you've got no vested interest in stability, if chaos because you are run by the strongest man in the room, your only interest is in prolonging chaos and mixing things up. So it does seem, what you're describing does seem likely to favor the Russian position going forward. And for anybody who's got a vested interest in everybody agreeing on people being on the same page, on resolving differences, they're going to have a hard time in this world that you're describing.
I think there is a propensity, but also Russia, and not only Russia, I don't want to make a case only about Russia, has a propensity. I mean, it's because it had the whole field, the negative, the disinformation for itself. It has not been opposed until recently. So there was nothing to deter the type of it. Now there are certain actions taken, very mildly. Again, not mentioning the big elephant, but these type of reactions, and probably, but yes, the system seems to encourage a little bit, on the dark side of the use of the digital, as opposed to the Arab Spring promise, the collaboration, the solving of common problems, the climate change coalitions to be drawn together and move again, with the plan. So that type of thing. But I think that's that's in a sense the reason that actually has to be considered seriously and to see even if it to be prepared in case things can take that turn.
Very helpful.
Yeah, there is a certain irony, is there not, that the so-called godmother of U.S. digital statecraft, Hillary Clinton, was defeated by a Twittermeister.
The emotional factor, the emotional connection factor.
In evidence. Someone, yes.
So I'm just wondering if there are no other people from, like South Korean State Department here yet, or BOFA here, but I was just wondering if there were any initiatives or thoughts or ideas or conversations that are going around and how to invest in this new digital diplomacy tools. And if so, if Korean Foundation has one, I'd be delighted to know. And if I could find any ways to collaborate and further the initiative, I would be really happy to be involved in.
Dr. Choi?
Yeah.
Actually, from the public, I think those ideas can be made. But I want to be very strategic in deploying, in carrying out our activities and programs. So that means that I have to prioritize the programs and activities in terms of attaining the foreign policy goals. So if the current foreign policy goals are in a certain direction, I have to create programs and initiatives that are best suited to that purposes. So we know that there are a lot of soft power assets and a lot of mediums we can use, but I have to be most selective from among many choices and alternatives. So it depends on the situation and on the nature of the issues. As I mentioned in my remarks, there are two dimensions, particularly in the issues, of the international conflict. I think the comfort to women is just like that. If we post a lot of information on the internet, it can provoke the Japanese government. It's not necessarily quite beneficial to the Korean government's public diplomacy goals, I think. So we have to be very, my position is that we have to be very selective in choosing from many available means and mediums and tools in the public diplomacy to attain the specific foreign policy goals. That's why we don't do that right now.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm the Consul General of Japan, and it seems to me that in the digital field, the problem of a digital campaign is that you don't notice that it's being done unless you plug into it. Now, unfortunately, there are pro-North Korean websites located in Southern California poisoning the Korean-American community in the Korean language. So an average American will not notice that it's being done, that the pro-North Korea agenda is being promoted here. And as Ambassador Park said earlier this morning, an average American doesn't know that the Korea is divided into the North and the South. So it will be a very dangerous situation if something very, very wrong happens on the peninsula. All Korean Americans will be seen as an inimical particle. So what would the strategy be in the digital field to at least enlighten the American public that North Korea is something different?
Does either of you want to venture a stab at that one? Possible strategies maybe to deal with that situation?
Well, I mean, again, going back to the example of the European Action Service Unit, which was set up about 2 years ago. And what they do is to monitor exactly the type of conversation you mentioned, but in Europe. And they produce a report every week which is sent to all news channels and also people who are interested, influencers. The goal is media literacy, to raise awareness about the problem and to put that into context. Look what happens, where is it coming, what kind of visuals are used, who are the sources promoting that. So in a sense, it's a systematic campaign that has been going on for some time. And it was intentional with a very minimal budget. That was, I mean, the European Parliament has increased the budget this year because it seems to be efficient, and also because you need to reach the general public. It has a limited mandate. It's not allowed to retaliate, because that goes into some other moral, ethical issues. But I think as a first step, you follow it, and you know about it. Not so many people know about it. So in a sense, that will be one way to make the phenomenon visible and to raise awareness about a situation that actually can be very detrimental to the relationship that you mentioned. So that's one example that I can mention happening right now.
Regrettably, we have run out of time. I want to thank Dr. Bjola and Director Choi for their participation, and to you all for the great questions. It's been really interesting from my perspective, and I hope we take some of this information away and apply it in a productive way. Thank you very much.